Hello and welcome to this on-the-fly introduction to what I hope becomes a long-term series for Velocity Kinetics, but it came to mind midway through my shift. This has been recorded on Boxing Day, so I've worked 7 till 3 on Boxing Day for a bank, so it's a bank holiday, and normally that means you don't work, but this one I do. Anyway, that aside, we've got a new series hopefully coming. And this is a test video to see how well liked this will be. It's called We Answer. And this first video, we answer a question that, we answer a question that I heard someone mention when we were talking F1 at work. And what it is why is air so important to a Formula 1 car? Let's get an answer going, shall we? Hello and welcome to this edition of We Answer. So, what are we going to answer? We're going to answer the first question. Why is air so important to an F1 car? Now, air is important to just about any racing car in the sense that it requires it to get through the air, basically. And how much air there is affects how well it can be done. So, if you're in an area with not very much air, so i.e. high altitude, say for instance if we look at Mexico City Grand Prix, you've got next to no air up there because it's very, very high up, and likewise in Brazil it's very high up as well. So you've got to set the car up completely differently for going up high. So it all affects how the car is set up. So for instance, you might run more rake, less rake, more wing, less wing even, sorry. Affects how much drag is dropped when you open up your DRS, etc. Now, the air is the first thing that will interact with the car, so running through the air first, depending on how your front wing is set up, you've set up for more outwash, so as the air flows through, it pushes the air that way and makes a very, very wide aerodynamic shape. Then it makes it harder for cars to follow. But if you're using some more inwash front wing that pushes the air around the other side of the tyres, and you can push it down under the floor and then create more downforce through an inwash front wing. So it's all about how the car interacts. Now, if you want to have a good reaction with the air, then you put more flick ups and more flaps and crank the downforce up to the maximum. But like I said, if you're somewhere where the air is very thin, i.e. not a lot of air, then you can do some weird and wonderful things. So you can run the Monaco levels of downforce, but get Monza speeds, which is just insane. And then when it's wet, there's more air around, so the car is going to react differently with the air. Then when it's hot, it'll react differently as well. And then if you've got, looking back at things like for instance Venturi tunnels running under the car, for instance with the ground effect cars of the 70s, that was all about channeling the air and managing it. That Brabham fan car was all about generating more downforce. So essentially, not just in F1, but just about any racing series that needs a lot of downforce potentially, or just about any racing car needs some downforce, you want to stay on terra firma. But the more air you've got running over the aerodynamic parts of the car, the more grip you can generate, the less grip you can generate, the faster you can go, the slower you can go. You're talking about tiny, tiny margins. You put a little bit too much rear wing on, you've got at Monza, for instance, you've got far too much drag. You don't put on enough rear wing somewhere that requires high downforce, like say, for instance, Hungary. And whilst you've got a car that might get a faster speed on the straights, because all the tight and twisty, you're gonna struggle. Or even too little downforce in somewhere like Monaco, you might go fast through the tunnel, and on the way to the swimming pool you might get quick going to Rascasse, or coming up through the first turn up after Saint-Devant and going up the hill towards Casino Square, you might achieve some fast speeds. But then after Casino, when you're going through Portier and so on, and so on down the track, you're not going to have any grip to turn the car in, because the way the car manages the air can then affect everything else. So say for instance, it can affect your fuel consumption in an F1 car, and again it can affect your road car, but it can affect the fuel consumption in an F1 car. So if the car's set up for too much drag, it's going to be working harder to get through the air, which means it's going to be burning more fuel. It can affect how the tyres are working, so if the car's got too much drag on, it might be pushing itself too hard into the ground, so then it's so then the tyres are just being pushed really hard in and being worked into the ground too hard. Think for instance, any way I can describe the motion I'm making, a bit like if you imagine just about any scene in a film where they show someone throwing a cigarette on the ground and then squashing it with their foot. It's kind of that same motion, and if there's too much, the tyres end up basically being destroyed in that same manner. If you've got too little downforce, then when you're trying to come out of a corner, the car will just spin the rear wheels up, and then you're destroying your tyres that way. So in that sense, the air is very important. However, on an F1 car, where it is also very critical, is for the engine and for cooling. Now, I'm not going to talk about the fuel's combustion cycle, because that's a given. Without air, the combustion cycle just doesn't happen. But also in F1 cars, they're doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things, trying to add, like for instance, oil vapor, etc., to get the best return on the explosion for the fuel in the cylinder. But anyway, an F1 car doesn't have a fan in it like your road car. So for instance, I go lift up the bonnet on my Suzuki, tucked in underneath the front part. I think it's just near the intercooler on mine, because the intercooler's sort of tucked down towards the bottom and the fan's about there. Anyway, the fan helps cooling, because the faster you go, it spins the air up faster, cools the air block and the engine block a bit more. Now, a Formula 1 car doesn't have that to help it as it goes. The faster an F1 car goes, the cooler it essentially can run. Now, my car can just sit on, and even supercars all up to things like McLaren F1s, Bugatti Veyrons, Chirons, Regeras, Argueras, and so on and so forth. You can turn them on and walk away. They can idle for a long time because they've got the fan to help cool themselves down. Now, granted, they don't like idling. A lot of cars really don't like idling for long periods of time. Nonetheless, it is something that they can do. If you were to let an F1 car idle, it will idle for a fraction of the amount of time of just about any engine on the planet, because there's no air going through it to cool down. Now, granted, they are not as bad as they were in, say, the 80s, the 90s, even the early 2000s, where if you left the car idling on the grid too long, then goodbye engine, it would just be blowing up left, right and centre. Now, obviously, these current generation F1 cars have got things like the batteries and the ERS unit to cool as well, whereas obviously the cars before would have just had the engine to worry about. So that's why they have them now. You've got some, for instance, the Sauber and the Alfa had an interesting dual roll hoop design. Mercedes have split up the air box at the top, split it 3 ways to cool things like the turbocharger and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, that's why it's so important. A still F1 car is a bad F1 car when it's turned on. That is. So it just can't cope with it. And then likewise on the brakes are air cooled. Now on your road car you can stamp on the brakes all day long until they've had enough, and up to a certain degree you won't experience that much fade depending on how heavily you're using them, but nonetheless you will still experience a little bit. But they'll more or less cope. They won't normally get too hot unless you're absolutely thrashing it around some roads around the Peak District, around the Lake District, or even in some places on the Scottish coast or even the North East coast in England. You won't have to a point to worry about the brakes getting overly hot, or unless your car is particularly heavily loaded, then you're asking a lot of the brakes. But an F1 car has carbon brakes. Now the ducts on the brakes, they run them at the absolute edge of what they need, so they don't put big ducts on just to make sure they stay nice and cool. Phone again. They don't put big ducts on to keep them nice and cool. They put the very smallest ducts on that they can get away with. And why do they do that? Because the big ducts create more drag, which then brings us back around to the first problem. And likewise, the air pods in F1 cars are very small, very tightly managed. And why? Again, because big air pods, side pods, big airbox means bad aerodynamics. For instance, if the big, remember the Ligier, I think it's the LS70, I think it was, had the one that was nicknamed the Teapot, that had the giant airbox on it, really high up. If that was the way to go, then we'd still be doing it. But it's not. It's really bad for the drag, and it's more efficient to have a larger hole lower down. But still, that is why air is important to an F1 car, and it's just why it's just not as simple as, we'll put a fan on it. It's just not that possible. The rules do not permit them to do so. If they did, then they would. the Alfa Romeo Brabham fan car got banned because they claim the fan was for engine cooling, but they're using it to generate downforce. Now in F1 they will always bend the rules as much as they can, maybe even get close to borderline cheating, but they will do what they can, and that was creating so much downforce that cornering speeds were getting insanely dangerous for the time. Now maybe now could possibly get away with it, but still, if you said to the F1 teams, okay, you can put a fan in there to keep the car cool, excellent, okay, how do we use it to make downforce? That'll be the first way they'll look at going about it. Someone will find a way of somehow mounting it on the bottom of the engine to say, well, actually that's cooling the engine the best, but find an aerodynamic advantage. It's just going to be the way it happens. But I hope this is a good answer to the why is air so important to an F1 car. Please ask more questions. We'll see if we can do this. We'll try and, with this series, we're going to try and keep the answers short, maybe 10-11 minutes at a maximum if we can do it. If it's a fairly straightforward question, if the question warrants that much answering. If it's a more complex one, then we might evolve it out into bigger videos. But keep liking and subscribing, and we'll answer the questions. The logo at the moment, the intro slate, is a working slate. So it might change, it could be different, it could stay the same, I don't know yet, because I haven't got the greatest computer in the world to do it. It's still a pretty good computer, just starting to show its age. And with that in mind, saying about the computer showing its age, please remember to keep donating via the PayPal link, paypal.me/Velocity Kinetics. This will help us get, for instance, more computers to do better editing, to get better camera equipment, to even potentially try and get some different vehicles to do road tests on, because I really enjoyed that video. Now, whilst this has been recorded on the 28th of December. This has obviously not come out until 2020, because I said I would be keeping radio silence. I appreciate I said if I got a video out, but I need some time to myself for a little bit. But like I said, please keep liking and subscribing to the page. Follow us on YouTube as well. Please just help the page grow. We had a massive growth last year, and the year before we went from like 3 likes up to 60 odd, and it was fantastic. I wish we could try and push it forwards again. I appreciate I could push it forwards more if I had the money to pay for Facebook advertising, but I can't justify the expense to do so. But anyway, I hope everyone is safe, and just drive safe, look after yourselves, and we will see you at some point shortly for a recap video on the 2019 F1 season, and just maybe cars in general for 2019. Thank you.